At the time, they were convinced of one thing, that this American weapon wasn't an exception anymore. Not a one-off, not an oddity tied to a single unit, but something that could show up anywhere, on short notice, without warning, and in enough numbers to matter. From their perspective, this belief didn't begin as propaganda. It began as paperwork, a fragment of a report, a description from a patrol, a note from an artillery liaison, an after-action summary written under stress by men who were trying to explain why a plan had suddenly stopped working. And these accounts didn't read like certainty. They read like a growing pattern. They described a weapon that seemed to appear at the exact wrong time, a weapon that forced changes in behavior even when no one could prove it was present, a weapon that didn't need to be seen in large numbers to shape decisions, because once it entered the mental map, it stayed there. In staff work, there's a difference between what you know and what you must plan for. And war punishes planners who assume the enemy's best capability is rare, temporary, or isolated, especially when the cost of being wrong is catastrophic. So the logic became cautious, then systematic. If this weapon might exist in the sector, you don't plan as if it's absent. You plan as if it's possible. And if it's possible, you begin to allocate time, fuel, and manpower to counter it, whether it appears or not. That is how a limited capability becomes a general fear. Because the first thing the weapon changes is not the battlefield. It changes the timetable. Columns wait longer before moving. Recon becomes slower and more deliberate. Routes are altered, not because the weapon has been confirmed, but because you can't exclude it. Commanders begin choosing safer options that cost momentum. Over time, that creates a kind of quiet distortion. A delay here, a detour there, extra security at a crossing, a convoy held back because someone remembers a report from another front. And when those small decisions pile up across a theater, the enemy has achieved something without firing a shot. They've made your army start spending its own efficiency. What gave this belief its strength was not one dramatic incident. It was repetition across different channels, often secondhand, sometimes contradictory, rarely complete. One unit reports encountering the weapon under a very specific set of conditions. Another unit hears about it and assumes it can happen again, but doesn't know the constraints. A staff officer summarizes both reports and removes nuance, because summaries do that. Then the summary is forwarded upward, and by the time it reaches a planning desk, the story has changed shape. What began as, "we saw it once in limited conditions," becomes, "we should expect it." And once planners start expecting it, it becomes embedded in doctrine. Informally at first, then more explicitly. You can see this pattern in how militaries write. They start adding phrases like, "assume the enemy has access to," "expect the possibility of," "do not rule out." Those are not dramatic sentences, but they are how fear becomes policy. At a certain point, even commanders who doubt the weapon's scale will still behave as if it's widespread, because the organization around them begins to treat it that way. That's the difference between a rumor and a belief. A rumor is something soldiers talk about. A belief is something staff plans around. And from their perspective, the belief held together, because there were enough encounters to make it credible. Not enough to confirm mass deployment, but enough to confirm that it existed, that it worked, and that American forces were willing to use it when the situation fit. And that's the key detail. The weapon wasn't imagined. It wasn't fictional. It wasn't a ghost story. It was real, but rare, situational, dependent on logistics and timing. The problem was scale. They did not think they were dealing with a capability that appeared only under narrow conditions. They believed they were facing something that could be pulled from a standard supply chain and placed into the field at will. So they prepared for a distribution system that didn't exist. They built defensive assumptions around a weapon that could not realistically be everywhere at once. And once that assumption was accepted, it became self-reinforcing. Every unexplained setback became proof. Every delay became confirmation. Every cautious decision, made to avoid the weapon, became a cost paid to a weapon that might not even be there. That is the belief. Not that the weapon was invincible. Not that America had invented magic. Just that it had become normal. And when an army believes a rare tool has become normal, it starts fighting a war against a shadow of its own assumptions. The weapon wasn't everywhere, but the fear of it was. And that fear, more than the weapon itself, was what shaped the next set of decisions. From their perspective, the belief wasn't irrational. It was a conservative response to weak signals that pointed in the same direction. A staff officer doesn't get clarity. He gets fragments. One report says the weapon appeared during a night action. Another says it was used in a narrow window of weather. A third mentions it only indirectly, through what it forced a unit to do or stop doing. None of that proves scale, but it does prove capability. And in war, proven capability matters more than perfect accounting. Because the moment you admit a capability exists, even in limited form, you have to ask a practical question. If it shows up here, what stops it from showing up elsewhere? That question is where rational caution begins. Frontline reports are written under pressure, often after losses, and almost always with incomplete information. A unit might encounter the weapon once, but the effect is sharp enough that it reshapes how they describe the entire engagement. They don't write, "We encountered it briefly." They write, "Enemy weapon present." Or worse, they write as if the weapon was a feature of the terrain, something built into the battlefield. Because that's what it feels like when it appears at the worst possible moment. And once that language enters the reporting chain, it hardens as it climbs. A battalion report becomes a regimental summary. A regimental summary becomes a corps estimate. A corps estimate becomes a theater-level assumption. At each step, nuance is compressed. Constraints disappear. Edge cases become typical. Not because people are stupid, because staff work is designed to compress. So yes, the belief made sense, because the bureaucratic machinery of war naturally turns scattered encounters into generalized risk. A skeptical audience sometimes forgets this. Militaries do not plan around averages. They plan around the maximum plausible danger because the penalty for underestimating is irreversible. If the weapon is rare and you overestimate it, you waste resources. If the weapon is common and you underestimate it, you lose units. That trade is not symmetric. So from their perspective, assuming wide deployment, even if unproven, was rational. Not because they believed in myths, but because it was the safer error. If your job is to keep a front from collapsing, you don't gamble on the enemy being short on a capability you've already seen. You treat rare as unknown and unknown as possible. This is one of the most important mechanisms behind the belief. You don't always need to see the weapon to feel its consequences. If the capability forces you to change routes, delay movement, hold armor back, disperse formations, spend more time on reconnaissance, burn more fuel repositioning, then the weapon is shaping you even when it's absent. And from the German perspective, repeated odd behavior from American units could be read as proof of distribution. Because the U.S. Army had a certain pattern when it had a tool available, it standardized the method. Once an American capability became reliable, it tended to show up again, because U.S. logistics could support repetition. So if the weapon appeared once, then again, always in moments that mattered, it was reasonable to assume it was being integrated, not improvised. The weapon didn't need to be everywhere. It only needed to appear often enough to suggest it could be. This is not mythology. It's strategic logic. By mid to late war, the Americans were known for one thing that shaped enemy assumptions. They could scale. So, if a German staff saw a new American capability appear, even a limited one, he had to factor in what American industry could do with it in 6 months. That changes how you interpret the present. A weapon that appears rare today might be common tomorrow, and you don't get warning when that transition happens. Your first warning might be catastrophic loss. So it was rational to anticipate abundance whenever the Americans demonstrated a workable weapon. The belief wasn't just about what existed now. It was about what could plausibly exist soon. Even disciplined staffs fall into a trap. They search for patterns that reduce uncertainty. When you have incomplete information, your mind, and your organization, prefers a coherent story to a fragmented one. Americans have this weapon everywhere, is coherent. It helps planners make decisions. Americans have it sometimes, under specific constraints we don't fully understand, is honest, but operationally difficult. And when the battlefield is moving fast, the organization will often choose the model that allows faster decisions, even if it's less accurate. So from their perspective, the everywhere belief functioned like a compression algorithm for fear and ambiguity. It was not intellectually clean, but it was operationally usable. A limited weapon can generate a widespread belief if it creates uncertainty about where it might appear next. And uncertainty is expensive. It forces you to defend more places, hold more reserves, and slow your tempo. So it made sense for them to think the weapon was widespread, because that assumption explained why their decisions were becoming more constrained, even without decisive defeats. This is the key point a technical audience will respect. They weren't dumb. They were responding to a risk model with incomplete data. They saw a capability. They saw repeated effects. They knew America could scale. They knew underestimation kills faster than overestimation. So they planned accordingly, and that planning, reasonable in isolation, would become the foundation of the systemic error later. The illusion didn't start with propaganda. It started with paperwork. Not the polished kind. Staff paperwork under pressure, built from fragments, passed upward, and compressed at each step until rare quietly became assumed common. Frontline reports are not written to map the enemy's industrial capacity. They're written to explain what happened and prevent it from happening again. So the language centers on effect. Enemy weapon encountered. Unexpected capability observed. Unit suffered losses due to new system. Recommend countermeasures immediately. Notice what's missing. Frequency. A platoon that sees the weapon once may report it as a defining feature of the engagement, because for them, it was. A single appearance can still be decisive, and decisive events get emphasized even if they're statistically rare. So the very first layer of reporting begins with a bias. Significance over representativeness. Now the machine starts. A battalion collects reports from multiple companies. A regiment aggregates multiple battalions. A division aggregates multiple regiments. A corps collects across divisions. At each level, the staff is trying to answer a different question. Lower levels, what hurt us? How do we avoid it? Higher levels, what capability does the enemy have in this sector? And that shift matters, because once you start aggregating, you stop thinking in events, and you start thinking in presence. If 3 separate units on 3 separate days mention the same capability, even if each saw it only once, the corps level summary is likely to read, enemy weapon present in sector. That phrase sounds modest, but it carries a hidden implication. Availability. Presence becomes assumed repeatability. Lower level reports often contain hedging. Possibly. Suspected. Cannot confirm. May have been. Those qualifiers tend to vanish as the report moves up. Not because staffs are dishonest, because summaries are designed to be actionable. A corps commander doesn't want a paragraph of ambiguity. He wants a sentence he can plan around. So the language shifts subtly. Suspected presence becomes reported presence. Possible deployment becomes indications of deployment. Limited sightings becomes increasing reports. By the time it reaches an operations estimate, the weapon is no longer seen once. It is in the area. And in the area is the seed of the illusion. This is a feedback loop. Once the belief exists, actions start reflecting it. Units change routes. Columns disperse. Movement slows. Additional reconnaissance is ordered. Reserve armor is held back. If Germans are watching the front, they don't need to see the weapon to infer it. They can interpret Allied behavior as evidence of capability, and then treat that inference as confirmation. So now reports contain a second-order distortion. We observed unusual caution, dispersal, delays, likely due to enemy weapon. What began as a weapon report becomes a behavior report, and behavior reports tend to spread faster because they appear everywhere. The belief reproduces itself. Staffs love labels. Once a capability gets a label, especially if it's memorable, it stops being a technical detail and becomes a category. Instead of, we encountered this system under these specific conditions, you get, beware. And once it becomes shorthand, it starts appearing in places where it may not belong. A unit takes losses from an unknown cause, the label is applied. A commander can't explain a setback, the label is applied. A staff wants to justify caution, the label is applied. This isn't fraud, it's cognitive economy under stress. The label turns complex uncertainty into a single word. And once that word spreads, the weapon feels ubiquitous, because the word is. This is crucial. If a unit moves through a sector and does not encounter the weapon, that usually isn't news. Nothing happened rarely becomes a message that travels far. So the reporting system is biased. Contacts get recorded, absences get forgotten. That means the data set itself is skewed. Over time, headquarters receives a steady stream of weapon-observed reports, but very few weapon-not-observed reports. Even if the weapon is rare, the paper trail makes it feel frequent, because the paper only records exceptions. From their perspective, the enemy didn't see a clean distribution curve. They saw spikes, and spikes look like escalation. So the illusion of scale wasn't born from a single false report. It emerged from impact-focused language aggregation, qualifier loss, reaction-based inference, shorthand labels, and reporting bias toward events over non-events. By the time German planners had to make decisions, they weren't planning against the weapon's real numbers. They were planning against a paper version of the front, one where rare encounters appeared as continuous presence. And once a staff begins planning against that paper reality, it becomes self-reinforcing. Because now every move is shaped by the fear of a weapon that might only appear occasionally, but whose presence on the page looks constant. By the time the belief reached senior planners, it stopped being a rumor and became a planning assumption. And that is where the real damage begins, because armies don't pay for myths with embarrassment. They pay with fuel, time, tonnage, and opportunity. This is the systemic error, treating a rare capability as if it were a common, repeatable feature of the enemy force, and then building procedures, allocations, and doctrine around that assumption. Staff work has a natural bias. You plan for the scenario that can hurt you most. That's rational, up to a point. But once a rare weapon is treated as widespread, worst case stops being a hedge and becomes the standard. So you see planning language shift from if encountered to when encountered. The difference is subtle, the consequences aren't. You start seeing orders that assume the weapon is present even without confirmation. All movements will be executed under conditions. Route selection must assume threat. No concentration of armor within X distance. No daylight movement unless covered by specific response. This creates a baseline of friction across the entire force. Not because the weapon is everywhere, but because the planning assumption is. Once leadership believes a capability is widespread, they begin assigning scarce assets to it. That usually looks like extra reconnaissance devoted to confirming, denying the threat. Engineering assets pulled to build alternate routes, dispersal areas, dummy positions. Air assets retasked to hunt the weapon's carriers, or suspected launch points, reserve armor held back as insurance instead of used for momentum special ammunition allocated broadly just in case, leaving shortages elsewhere. The systemic error here isn't that any one countermeasure is wrong. It's that countermeasures become generalized, applied across the map, instead of at the few places where they'd matter. You end up spending a lot of effort protecting yourself from something that will rarely appear, while underinvesting in the things that will certainly appear: artillery, air attack, ambush, weather, mud, broken bridges, fuel limits. When the belief hardens, behavior changes at scale. Columns disperse more than needed. Units move slower. Commanders become conservative about timing and exposure. That shows up as delaying advances to clear terrain that doesn't actually need clearing. Waiting for escorts that aren't truly required, widening intervals between vehicles to reduce vulnerability, overusing night movement, which increases mechanical breakdowns and navigation errors, choosing longer routes to avoid likely threat corridors, burning fuel and time. All of this reduces operational tempo, and tempo is not just speed. Tempo is the ability to synchronize artillery, air, armor, infantry, logistics, and follow-on exploitation. When tempo drops, even small enemy forces can stabilize. They get hours they shouldn't have had to dig in, reposition guns, seed mines, pull back intact units, or establish new defensive lines. So the rare weapon doesn't have to destroy your army. It only has to make you late. Here's one of the most enduring forms of systemic error: doctrine. Once a staff believes the weapon is widespread, temporary lessons learned become policy. New standing orders root discipline changes. Modified formations, new training priorities, new procurement requests, revised threat handbooks. These changes are not easily reversible because institutions treat them as adaptation. Even if later evidence suggests the weapon is rare, reversing doctrine looks like recklessness. Are you saying the threat is gone? So the system keeps the rule, and that rule keeps shaping behavior long after the fear should have cooled. In effect, the belief outlives the reality. Once you've decided the weapon is everywhere, you begin seeing it everywhere. Any unexplained loss becomes likely the weapon. Any delay becomes maybe the weapon. Any nervous report becomes further indications. This is not stupidity. It's pattern matching under stress. But it amplifies the illusion. The belief shapes behavior. Behavior produces cautious reports. Cautious reports reinforce the belief. This is the feedback loop that turns a rare capability into an operational obsession. The most expensive consequences are the ones that never show up as casualties or equipment losses. They show up as bridges taken later than they could have been, retreats completed cleanly instead of becoming routes pockets that should have been sealed but weren't, breakthroughs that slowed into methodical advances, enemy reserves that escaped because you moved as if the rare threat was guaranteed. Armies can measure vehicles destroyed. They struggle to measure the moments they almost ended a campaign earlier. That is why the systemic error is so dangerous. It doesn't have to be dramatic to be decisive. So the rare American weapon didn't need to be everywhere. It didn't need to dominate the battlefield. It only needed to do one thing: force an entire planning system to behave as if it were common. And once that happened, the weapon's true power wasn't its metal or explosive weight. It was its ability to steer decisions. Because in war, a few credible reports, handled the wrong way, can cost more than 1,000 rounds of ammunition ever could. On the American side, the picture looked very different. There was no secret program producing the weapon in large numbers, no doctrine built around its widespread use, no assumption that it would decide battles on its own. In reality, the weapon existed, but narrowly. It was tied to specific units, specific conditions, specific windows of opportunity. Its use depended on logistics, availability, terrain, and timing aligning at the same moment. And that alignment was rare. American commanders did not see it as a standard solution. They saw it as an option. One tool among many. Something to be used when circumstances allowed, not something to be relied upon. This mattered because it shaped how Americans thought about the weapon. They did not plan around it being everywhere. They did not slow operations to wait for it. They did not restructure entire formations to protect or enable it. When it was present, it was used. When it wasn't, operations continued without it. From the American perspective, nothing fundamental had changed. Reports from the field reflected this. Mentions of the weapon were specific, localized, often brief. After-action documents treated its appearance as noteworthy, but not transformative. There was no language suggesting saturation. No indication that it had become a default element of combat. Even officers who respected its effectiveness understood its limits. They knew production was constrained. They knew deployment was uneven. They knew training and maintenance requirements prevented rapid expansion. Most importantly, they knew the weapon solved a narrow problem, not the entire battlefield. American planning remained grounded in conventional realities: manpower, supply, movement, coordination. The weapon did not replace these, it supplemented them. And because Americans never assumed it was ubiquitous, they never reorganized their system around it. That asymmetry is critical. One side treated the weapon as a rare capability, the other treated it as an omnipresent threat. The Americans absorbed its successes quietly, without rewriting their assumptions. The Germans absorbed those same encounters and recalibrated everything. This difference explains why the weapon's real impact was disproportionate to its actual presence. It was not powerful because it was everywhere. It was powerful because the enemy believed it was. Once that belief took hold, German countermeasures followed, not impulsively, not carelessly, but logically, based on the model they had constructed. And that model assumed scale. German planners were not responding to isolated incidents. They were responding to what they believed was a systemic shift in American capability, something already integrated, something they would face repeatedly, across multiple fronts, so their countermeasures were designed accordingly. Resources were spread wider than necessary. Defensive spacing increased. Movement became more cautious. Units behaved as if exposure was constant, not occasional. Each adjustment made sense on its own. Together, they created friction. Technical responses followed the same pattern. Solutions were engineered for frequent encounters, not rare ones. Procedures assumed repeated exposure, not sporadic contact. Protection was built for a threat expected daily, not one appearing unpredictably. That mismatch mattered, because protecting against a constant danger carries a cost, and that cost is paid whether the danger is present or not. German units began to move as if every action carried the same risk. Decisions that once favored speed now favored caution. Opportunities that required rapid exploitation were passed over, not because the enemy was strong, but because the enemy might be. The countermeasures worked against an imagined battlefield. They solved a problem that existed mainly in reports, not in numbers. Another factor compounded the error: delay. German intelligence arrived late, filtered through command layers, shaped by stress and uncertainty. By the time patterns were identified and responses formulated, the original conditions had often changed. What they were countering was not a living system, but an impression frozen in time. And impressions are dangerous, because once doctrine shifts, it is difficult to reverse. Training adapts. Manuals change. Habits form. Caution becomes normal. At that point, the weapon no longer needs to appear. Its influence persists even in absence. This was the critical failure. German countermeasures were not defeated by the weapon itself. They were defeated by the belief that the weapon was everywhere. The Americans paid the cost of producing something rare. The Germans paid the cost of defending against it everywhere. Only one side could afford that imbalance. And by the time the scale mismatch became clear, the damage was already done. Not in destroyed units, but in lost momentum, missed chances, and a system that had learned to fear something that seldom appeared. That is how the weapon achieved its greatest effect, not through widespread use, but through widespread expectation. The strategic consequences of this misperception unfolded gradually, not in a single decision, but across months of accumulated adjustments. German planning became heavier where it needed to be flexible. Units were positioned to guard against a threat that might appear, rather than optimized for the threats that were actually present. This reshaped how time, fuel, manpower, and attention were spent. Movement slowed. Routes were chosen for safety rather than advantage. Timetables widened. Commanders hesitated longer before committing, knowing that exposure, even brief, was assumed to be dangerous. None of this caused immediate collapse. That is precisely why it went unnoticed. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each was defensible. But together, they produced a measurable loss of tempo. War rewards momentum. It punishes hesitation. While German units acted as if the battlefield was saturated with a rare American capability, American forces continued operating under more realistic assumptions. They moved when opportunities appeared. They pressed advantages quickly. They accepted calculated risk because they were not burdened by the same imagined constraints. This asymmetry mattered more than raw numbers. German doctrine began to reflect caution where aggression was needed. Training emphasized avoidance. Planning emphasized protection. The fear of encountering the weapon began to shape behavior even when there was no evidence it was present. That is the quiet cost of overestimation. The weapon itself destroyed little directly, but the decisions made to defend against it altered campaigns indirectly. Operations took longer, windows closed, Allied forces exploited gaps that existed not because of superior firepower, but because of slowed reaction. By the time German command began to suspect that the threat was not as widespread as believed, the strategic environment had already shifted. The cost had been paid incrementally, across hundreds of small decisions that could not be reversed all at once. The weapon had done its work, not by force, but by distortion. The strategic consequences of this misperception unfolded gradually, not in a single decision, but across months of accumulated adjustments. German planning became heavier where it needed to be flexible. Units were positioned to guard against a threat that might appear, rather than optimized for the threats that were actually present. This reshaped how time, fuel, manpower, and attention were spent. Movement slowed. Routes were chosen for safety rather than advantage. Timetables widened. Commanders hesitated longer before committing, knowing that exposure, even brief, was assumed to be dangerous. None of this caused immediate collapse. That is precisely why it went unnoticed. Each decision made sense in isolation. Each was defensible. But together, they produced a measurable loss of tempo. War rewards momentum. It punishes hesitation. While German units acted as if the battlefield was saturated with a rare American capability, American forces continued operating under more realistic assumptions. They moved when opportunities appeared. They pressed advantages quickly. They accepted calculated risk because they were not burdened by the same imagined constraints. This asymmetry mattered more than raw numbers. German doctrine began to reflect caution where aggression was needed. Training emphasized avoidance. Planning emphasized protection. The fear of encountering the weapon began to shape behavior even when there was no evidence it was present. That is the quiet cost of overestimation. The weapon itself destroyed little directly, but the decisions made to defend against it altered campaigns indirectly. Operations took longer. Windows closed. Allied forces exploited gaps that existed not because of superior firepower, but because of slowed reaction. By the time German command began to suspect that the threat was not as widespread as believed, the strategic environment had already shifted. The cost had been paid incrementally, across hundreds of small decisions that could not be reversed all at once. The weapon had done its work, not by force but by distortion. After the war, with archives opened and records compared, a clearer picture emerged. The weapon had existed. Its effectiveness was real, but its scale had never matched the fear it inspired. Post-war analysis revealed how limited its deployment actually was. Production figures were modest, distribution uneven. Many units never encountered it at all. Others saw it once or heard about it secondhand. What stood out was not how often it was used, but how quickly belief outpaced reality. German intelligence officers reviewing wartime assessments acknowledged the gap. Reports had been accurate individually, but misleading collectively. Patterns were inferred where none truly existed. Rare encounters were interpreted as evidence of standardization. American records confirmed the contrast. There was no expectation that the weapon would be decisive, no belief that it would redefine warfare. It was cataloged as effective in narrow circumstances, nothing more. Historians studying both sides noticed the same dynamic repeating across different theaters and technologies. Weapons that appeared suddenly, performed well once, and vanished again often produced the strongest psychological effects. Not because they were dominant, but because uncertainty amplified them. The post-war lesson was uncomfortable for planners on both sides. Intelligence failures were not rooted in ignorance, but in reasonable assumptions made under pressure. The error was systemic, not personal. It emerged from incomplete information, filtered through urgency and fear. The reassessment did not assign blame so much as it revealed a pattern. When a system prepares for the worst version of a threat, it often sacrifices efficiency against the real one. That realization reshaped how future militaries thought about perception, signaling, and psychological weight. Not every weapon needed mass deployment to matter. Sometimes, limited use combined with enemy assumption was enough. This story is not really about the weapon. It is about belief. Wars are not fought only with machines and numbers. They are fought with expectations, assumptions, and incomplete pictures of reality. Decisions are made not on what is true, but on what appears plausible given the information at hand. In this case, a rare American capability produced effects far beyond its material footprint, not because it was superior, but because it was misunderstood. The enemy did not lose because the weapon was everywhere. They lost because they planned as if it were. That distinction matters. History shows that overestimation is often more dangerous than ignorance. A threat believed to be ubiquitous reshapes behavior even when it is absent. It slows action. It narrows options. It transfers initiative without a shot being fired. The most influential weapons are not always the ones that destroy the most equipment. They are the ones that alter how the enemy thinks, moves, and decides. This is why restraint matters in historical analysis. Not every success indicates dominance. Not every report implies scale. Not every innovation changes the war directly. Sometimes its greatest effect exists only in the mind of the opponent. Wars are often decided not by what exists in large numbers, but by what one side believes exists everywhere. And that belief, once established, is far harder to defeat than any weapon itself.